Welcome to the Spirit Mom Podcast, where we explore spiritual practices for healing, happiness, and a life of purpose after your child transitions back to spirit. I'm Schall, and I invite you to join us each Monday for enlightening conversations about spirituality, communicating with spirit, and rebuilding the relationship with your child in spirit. My guest this week on the Spirit Mom Podcast is Chris Hancock, a licensed psychotherapist. 20-some years into Chris's career, after seeing countless others through the range of psychosocial emotional struggles, Chris was met with his own dark night of the soul that brought him to his knees and left him questioning, do I still want to be a therapist? What does that even mean? Is it how I'm to continue to serve? All the way to the F am I? All of this led to Chris incorporating more spiritual practices into his counseling work, blending transpersonal internal family systems, quasi-shamanic, modern mystical, creative, and practical approaches. Chris helps awakening souls welcome all parts of self. Hey, Chris, welcome to the show.
Hello, Schall. Thank you for having me.
I'm pretty excited to have you here. I went through your website and there is a lot to unpack there.
That is true.
So I think I want to start with you and your experience. You were, for the most part, a traditional therapist until you had your own experience, a dark night of the soul that you say literally brought you to your knees.
Yeah, that's a good jumping in point for sure. Yes. What you say is true. I was more or less a traditional, kind of psychodynamically trained, somewhat integrative, always kind of holistically minded therapist, but more or less a straight ahead talk therapist, interpersonal, relational talk therapist. Until, about somewhere in 2018, it all started to come kind of crashing in various ways, different symptoms, sort of blood pressure, headaches, adrenal fatigue type stuff kept ramping up no matter what I seemed to do to try to mitigate it. It kept going. And there was obviously something there that was trying to get my attention. Midlife was approaching, turning 50 was approaching, definitely a lot of stress and just feeling kind of fatigued and beat up from a wonderful, but long and grueling adoption process of our two daughters. And just kind of burnout on, I think, really ultimately recognizing that staying in the box as a traditional counselor and therapist was really not expressing all of who I was and what I was here to do, at least in this field of the healing arts. So what I realized now, that's clearer now that wasn't then, was that this was not a sudden onset of a dark night, as they say. But I think I look back and I see that I was really in one for probably almost a decade and not really recognizing it for what it was because it was so kind of insidious. But somewhere in 2018, it all really ramped up to the point of me feeling like I was kind of on the edge of madness, because I really was for a minute there. And I was in a state of utter confusion, really, about what was what, right? Was this just like a midlife crisis, or was my marriage over, or am I just legit burned out on being a therapist and I need to chuck it all and do something different? So, with that confusion, that I could not find clarity in any traditional sense, I basically decided to do what I knew to do on paper and what I had attempted to help other people do who are going through the intersection of psychological and spiritual crises. Let's just put it that way, which was just to completely surrender, let go, pray, meditate, walk in the woods, rinse and repeat day in and day out. And that is exactly what I did. And I kept going and going. And I tried to keep it simple with just, in the surrendering part, just simply surrendering in the sense that I think anyone who hears that probably knows what I mean, and asking simply for clarity. Like, what is this that I am going through? What is it and what is it not? Please help me with some clarity so I know what to do or what not to do, right? And I'll maybe interject here that I think mainly the reason I knew that was the only way forward is because I've been a seeker, a spiritual student, a metaphysical seeker since long before I became a therapist, going all the way back to high school. My curiosity bloomed when I read books like The Doors of Perception and the Whitley Strieber Communion book, things like that, that just started to blow my mind and started to awaken me to just the infinite possibilities and how little we know about most everything. So, to put it one way, right? So basically, yeah. So to come back up to where I was, surrendering, praying, meditating, sitting, walking in the woods, rinse and repeat day in and day out. And eventually, in ways that are mostly hard to describe, the clarity that I was mostly asking for began to come, usually subtle, lifting of a fog or interjection of some kind of just wisdom or understanding, at least about what it wasn't, right? It began to be clear that I'm not just having a just true psychiatric breakdown. I don't need medication. I don't need to quit being a therapist. But basically everything has to, nor was my marriage over, thankfully. But everything else, basically, I'm at a crossroads and there big changes have to be made. And so in that time, 2018 into 2019, I started to experience two particular phenomenon. One was downloads, messages coming through in ways that I don't really know how to describe. They were not audible. It was almost like I was seeing the words in my mind's eye. They were just landing. I guess you could say like a telepathic message, but that sounds kind of funny. I don't really know that was it. It was like the onset of a claircognizant ability was coming in, and downloads that were speaking very brief and to the point, but providing nice shots of clarity. And then along with that, so one of those downloads was indicating that I was being given a gift on one particular day, a gift of holy discernment. I've told this many times to many people. And what I always say about it is that I knew that it was not my own mind that made that up because I don't really know what that means. I've never heard that phrase. But the phrase was, you are being given a gift of holy discernment. That was it. No instruction manual. It was sort of, I was left to my own devices to try to determine what that really means. And some weeks later, while I was in the middle of experimenting with a new method, an energy psychology type method, which utilizes muscle testing, kinesiological muscle testing, which is where the body gives you a kind of a yes or a no, strong or a weak signal, I began to notice that my own head started to involuntarily nod up and down in accord with the yes response or true. And then it would nod subtly to the left or to the right in accord with the no or the false read with the muscle testing. And it then took me another week or two experimenting with that to realize, oh, that's the practical application of this gift of holy discernment. And I was later able to determine, using that variability itself, that was given to me by the Holy Spirit. I've asked numerous times for confirmation if I have that right. Is that true? Is that accurate? It's always a yes. So that's kind of wild. And on from there. And then during my sits and meditations and surrenders, which I only became more committed to doing because I was getting very tangible help. So why would I stop? Right. So I kept going. And somewhere around that same time that download came in, I began to notice that my upper body, mainly my head, my upper body would begin to sway. Now, many people have experienced this. It's not that unusual of a thing. When energy starts moving through you, your body responds. But it became clear to me somehow that it was not just energy, but there were other beings, angels, divine beings, ascended masters, supreme beings, holy ones, a whole assortment that was coming in to work with me. The main motions, the shape of the swaying, I also noticed was in the infinity symbol. And that was pretty interesting, unmistakably kind of a sacred geometrical signal that something really kind of metaphysical is taking place here. And then using that quick yes or no ability to ask questions about, is there some other being from a higher realm with me? When my body was moving like that, it was always a yes. And then as long as I could think of who to ask that it might be, I would eventually usually land on who it was. And somewhere in that time, it became clear to me that Saint Germain was coming in as my gateway guide, my kind of initiation guide, so to speak. And then it was followed by other ascended masters. Mother Mary was coming in a lot. And then later, Sophia, Isis, all emanations of the one, of course. Many would think at this point, oh, the names and who they are doesn't matter. That's just ego, right? Okay, maybe, right? Like guilty as charged. I have an ego. And I feel like for me, it's like it's the geek in me, the spiritual geek that wants to know who is it, right? If different energies are going to work with me, I would like to know to satisfy the spiritual geek. But I also think that we are sovereign beings and we have the right to know if we're going to allow and open up to any higher energy to come in and work through us. I think we have the right to know who that is.
Do you think that when you're hearing who it is it possible that it's all source? Like you kind of just alluded to that a second ago. It's all source,
Yeah,
but because of what you need to do with the information, you're given a filter of who it might be that you're working through?
absolutely. Yes. Especially since, so I'll kind of fast forward it here because that was the long and short of, I think, a good answer to your question. The rest is history. I kept continuing on with the meditations, which I now think of as spirit communions. Because anytime I sit for that work, I'm not just meditating, my head starts rolling around and someone's with me every single time without fail, which is wonderful. So why would I not continue that? Right. And I've received all sorts of kind of messages and healings and activations and DNA activations and all sorts of stuff. But at some point, when I got comfortable enough, a few years into that, I started to get very strong nudges, I guess you'd say, to begin to offer this that's taking place in my personal work into my work with clients, those that would be open to it, of course, right? Which by this time, so we're fast forwarding to maybe 2023 is when I started to offer this to those that I knew would be open minded. And I was already attracting more and more people that were seekers in this way and open to the mystical. So I had more and more people to offer it to. And to basically formalizing this as a modality, as a method. And then in one of my sits, after a handful of these, where people were having really great experiences, where we would just surrender the session to whoever was going to come in and they would take over, set up a torus field or a toroidal field of energy, work through me just as kind of a battery or a copper, and make an offering of divine light, healing energy, and information to the recipient, the client. And so I asked in one of my meditations one day if there's anyone in the higher realms that has an idea for what to call this, I'm open to it. And by the end of that session, I got the name. And first I had gotten it backwards and I knew it wasn't quite right. I just sat with it and then it kind of rearranged itself. And it came from Saint Germain, who really, funny enough, doesn't come in a lot. Like some others come in much more often. He just pops in every once in a blue moon. But in that day, he gave me the name of what to call it. And that was multidimensional divine light transmission. And if you really think about it, that is exactly, it's the perfect name because that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. And that leads me to another question, but I do want to back up before I ask that question about your modalities, because I know you have more than one. But I
Yeah.
want to back up and ask you, first of all, I absolutely love the name of your practice, Therapy Outside the Box.
Isn't it
And
great? And I have to just make sure I say that was my wife's idea.
oh, yes,
Yeah. She just blurted it out one day, and I think we both knew instantly, as long as that's not taken and registered, that's it.
that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah, it's perfect.
Thanks.
I'd like you to tell us about, because on your website starts with you saying to people, you're not broken or abnormal. You don't have a mental disorder. There's nothing to fix, care, or get rid of. Talk about that.
Yeah, right. That's on my homepage. I think really that is mainly, Schall, my effort to make it really clear, hit you right over the head, right on the one of the first things you would read on my page about where I've come to philosophically about the larger issue of mental health and mental illness, psychiatry, medication, and specifically psychiatric diagnosis, which I've never been a fan of and only less so over time. So that statement that you read there, that's my attempt to speak to people that are looking for someone who's not interested in labeling, diagnosing, categorizing, somebody that recognizes, I think, like most people like you and I and many others, recognize that human suffering is so utterly unique, subjective, and complex that it can't be diluted down to a name or a label or a pill to solve it, right?
We will
Yeah.
all suffer at some point in our life. And I think what I'm attracted to with your approach to therapy is that some of these things that we go through, there isn't a
Yeah.
diagnosis for it, but you want somebody to help you work through it. Grief is one of the things.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yes, not something to be diagnosed or fixed. Yeah, but we all need someone when we're grieving, especially. We need to be with someone who can hold space, right? Who can hold space compassionately. Less is more. Not try to say too much because when it comes to grief, especially acute, especially like someone like you has experienced and so many others, right? I bet you'd agree. There's not much to say that's going to be very helpful, right? What we need is presence, compassion, and patience, and the long game of the long view of understanding it's a process that has no sequential step by step thing to it that we can apply, right? It's different for everybody.
Right.
And yeah, so it's interesting you say that because I don't have a lot of people who come to me and never have in an acute state of grief. Usually people come much later after they have found their way out of the deepest darkness of the pain of like losing a child or a sudden loss of anyone close. And
Yeah.
that makes sense to me that people
Yeah.
don't rush to a
Absolutely.
therapist's office in
Absolutely.
the acute stage of that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was 2 years before I even wanted to talk to anybody. And I did end up going to see a regular therapist, but he was somebody who had also lost a child. So I felt like there would be
Wow.
some common ground. But I didn't stick with it long because it wasn't what I needed. For me,
Right.
I knew that what was going to help me survive this and perhaps even get back to living again was going to be
Yeah.
a spiritual process.
Yeah.
And that came true. That was absolutely true for me.
I
Let's
bet.
talk about the
Yeah.
different spiritual modalities that you use. I know that you have the multidimensional is something that came to you, that was downloaded for you, that is your own process, but I know that you have a few other modalities you use. And
Sure. Okay. Right. So for short, MDLT, not a McDLT, if you know what I mean when I say that, but MDLT. Yeah, it's still evolving, but it's really just like for descriptive purposes, I describe it as a a co-facilitated mystical experience or a spiritual presence experience. And I think of it as entirely source guided because, like I had mentioned before, in that when myself and someone else agree to do that process, we are agreeing essentially to completely surrender the time, the session to whatever higher is going to come through. And 99 out of 100 times beforehand, I sit with it and I can get who it is that's going to come in. And by and large, I find that people really appreciate knowing. Like if I can email them ahead of time or when they come in, I can say, so what I got this morning is that Goddess Sophia and Archangel Chamuel are coming in for you today, right? Or Yeshua and some other angelic energy. It's often two. Sometimes it's one, it's often two, which is kind of interesting. And then the other thing I can ascertain, and this is just through using this kind of claircognizant, yes, no, holy discernment ability, is I will ask on what level of the person's being, of their mind, body, spirit complex, will the work be taking place, if that makes sense, right? And at this point, I'm aware that it's often either on the level of the I am presence, which in esoteric kind of Eastern thinking is the part of our being that is really the highest, even above, beyond the higher self, the closest to the Godhead. So is the work taking place on the level of their I am presence, the level of their higher self or holy Christ self, or the psychological level, neurological level, emotional, somatic, physical, genetic DNA, or on the level of their energetic body? I'm still trying to figure it out, but it can be any one of these levels that in the higher being's infinite wisdom, they already know what they're coming through. They already know what's needed most and what they want to offer to the person. I think it's only for me really to know who and on what level of their experience so I can convey that. So I might say to the person, you got Sophia and Chamuel coming in today, and they'll be working with you on the emotional or emotional body level. And most times when I tell people that, it resonates. It makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. They're like, okay, whatever. But it usually makes some kind of sense relative to what somebody maybe has been feeling misaligned with or out of balance or struggling with on some level, right? And where it goes from there, it's almost impossible to describe because you'd really have to more ask those experienced it. Because once I do my invocation, paying respect, honoring, and inviting in who is ever going to be the host. I invite in the entirety of the divine realm within the Christos and Father, Mother gods, the monad, Alpha, Omega, etc. And I often name all those that I can think of, invite them all in, as well as spirit guides, guardian angel, healed and well ancestors and loved ones. And then we settle in. My head starts wobbling around. I go into the mildest of sort of alternate state of consciousness, mildest trance state. And then the rest is really between the source or sources and the client. So I usually don't have much of an idea of what is going on until we come to the end, till we come to the close, and then we process and the client or the recipient tells me what they felt, sensed, heard, saw, experienced, and it runs the whole gamut. On the one end, people say, I just felt incredibly calm, or I felt a lot of peace, or I felt a sense of bliss or a presence of somebody loving being with me, and nothing more than that, which I say in itself is wonderful, right? Because most people never experience that in their entire lifetime, no matter what they do. So that's sort of the beginning of a spiritual presence experience, right? So that's on one end of the spectrum, all the way, let's say, to the wildest other end of the spectrum. I've had people go completely out of body and journey through the cosmos. I've had people experience really physiological, the beginning of like a safe Kundalini activation, and really feel that to the core of their being. I've had people report what could best be described as sort of shamanic dismemberment, psychic dismemberment, kind of like psychically being taken apart and put back together, like psychic surgery.
Oh
Um,
Lord, that word though.
yeah, yeah.
Dismemberment.
I know, I know. I mean, not dismembered and left there in pieces, but
Yeah.
put back together psychically, metaphorically, right? I've had Isis has come in a few times for people specifically to do soul retrievals. Again, kind of shamanically, but she does it in her own way. So that's at the more wild end of the spectrum. Most times it's something in between where people feel more than just calm and peace, but not as wild as like traveling the cosmos psychically dismembered. But feeling healing energy come through, seeing visions of Sophia or an archangel holding them and cradling them. Some people, a lot of it do with how sensitive and how much absorption somebody has the capacity to engage into, how deep they can go so they can really be open to receive. The better that people are able to do that, the more sort of potent healing or information visions or whatever is available they can connect to and experience, right? Does that kind of give a good overview of that?
Oh yes, and it brought up some more questions. So, and we've had this conversation last time we talked about
Yeah,
spiritually transformative experiences.
right.
And it sounds like a lot of people that come to you are getting into some different states that maybe they haven't been in before. I want to talk about spiritually transformative experiences because of having had one. It's something that changes you on a permanent basis. It changes you from where you were. It's not a
Right.
static thing, but you never go back after that, right? And one of the things that you say on your site is that you can't guarantee that, of course, but is it something that you work towards with people to really have a spiritually transformative experience, an awakening or meeting with another being, something that can
Yeah.
actually leave them with some kind of permanent
Mm.
change for the better?
One thing I started doing back when I was still kind of mostly in the box, I started dipping my toe outside the box where I got interested in spiritually transformative experiences. Let's just call them STEs, right? So I
Much
got
more.
really interested. I got interested in that. And I put together a sort of a subspecialty that I call Sport for Extraordinary Experience. Put that out with descriptions about the whole broad range of STEs that people are known to have experienced. Everything from Kundalini emergencies to UFO sightings or contact experiences or spontaneous psychic visions, the whole nine. Wanted to begin to attract those folks because, like I said, I've been interested in this since high school. And I really was feeling already, even before everything crashed in, that I need to start leaning into that and inviting that into my world. And those folks started to show up. So that was just more or less me letting the world know that, hey, I may not have all the answers and I may not get it all, but I'm a safe person for, as a mental health professional, I'm a safe person that I will take those experiences seriously. I will not judge or label you or try to send you to the hospital because you told me you saw a UFO or something. Right?
Yeah.
So that was getting my feet wet with interacting more with people who have had bona fide STEs. Also at that time, I was also the therapist for a monthly support group for experiencers, mainly of those who have had UFO contact, abduction experiences, all things related to that high strangeness part of CEs, right? And that was very valuable and informative. So I learned a lot from people in that. Um, so I think I would just make a little bit of a distinction for myself between holding space for those who have had any type of STE and what you were referring to, where I say on my site, like, I can't guarantee that you'll have an STE. I think really what I'm saying there is mainly with the multidimensional divine light transmission process, I cannot guarantee that you'll have a mystical experience like in the office with me, right? That what I can do is if you are relatively free of fear, have more faith than fear, you are open to receive and full of, say, unprocessed religious baggage or trauma, which would certainly block. If you meet those basic criteria and you have enough trust in me to allow me to open this up to the higher realms and invite whoever would wish to come in to bring an offering to you, then what I can do is set the stage with you for a co-facilitated spiritual presence experience or possible mystical experience.
What I'm curious about as far
Mhm.
as STEs go, because this absolutely changed everything about how I was experiencing grief. I have
Yeah.
not gone back to the old way of experienced grief since it happened. And what
Right.
would you like a spiritually transformative experience? What would your definition of that be?
Oh, yeah. Well, any kind of contact or perceptual experience with the non-ordinary or the anomalous or with something in the non-material realm or world has any kind of profound and or lasting effect on one's worldview, psyche, a personality, etc. How is
Okay.
that? That right off the top of my head.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's internal. I mean, it's something that you can internalize about your
Yes,
life and how you feel about your life and how you start moving through your life. Um,
absolutely. Utterly subjective and as broad as anything. And it's
there's so
like
many ways
only
to get there.
exactly, yes. Infinite varieties of anomalous experiences that people can have. I'm sure I'm not even aware of all the possibilities yet. But I think what really makes it transformative is what you've said now twice, that whatever the experience is, it changes you and you don't go back. You don't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah.
You're different. In some ways, you are altered and different as a result for the better. It may be confounding and sort of take time to integrate and understand, but it should be transforming for the positive, for the better, which I'll just say is the thing that separates it from, say, a more psychiatric or psychotic episode, right? And what's difficult here is that there's often overlap, right? There's often like the sort of Venn diagram, I guess, of the overlap between the two circles. Sometimes it is difficult to know because sometimes it's not just purely a spiritual experience or purely a psychiatric experience that somebody's had. There can be a blending of both. Like, I think it was Ken Wilber, the famous integral psychologist, that I think he called this what I'm talking about right here, the pre-trans fallacy, which is I'm going to try to I'm going to probably botch this, but basically he was saying in that there's the danger or the risk of seeing all spiritual experiences as well, all such experiences as purely psychiatric or purely spiritual, whereas sometimes it's a blending or there's an overlap, right? So a profound, sudden, spiritually transformative psychic experience, meaning it can cause disturbance, which can then look to someone like psychiatric symptoms. And that wouldn't be incorrect. but if you don't make space for understanding the spiritual component, then you're apt to commit what Wilber called the pre-trans fallacy, which is where you're writing it all off as purely psychiatric phenomenon, right? And then the opposite, where if somebody is having really bona fide psychosis or a psychiatric break or a brief episode for whatever reason, somebody who is just apt to be viewing everything as spiritual phenomenon is also going to miss the boat, right? And that can be dangerous, right? If somebody is having a psychiatric or a psychotic break and really needs more conventional intervention to stabilize them, but they're entrusting that with their care with somebody who is just spiritualizing the whole thing, we see how this could go, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Tell
So
us
so all I'm
about
saying there is it's tricky. It's tricky. It can be tricky.
yeah. Well, we're all tricky.
That's right.
Tell us about who comes to see you, especially now that you're working with these spiritual modalities. Who comes to see
Yeah.
you? What are they looking for? And what are some of the transformations that you've seen with your work?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Okay. Well, who comes to see me? I mean, all different kinds of folks, but what they all tend to have in common, unless they're just making an appointment with me like a shot in the dark, not knowing anything about me, which doesn't really happen. They've seen me talk like on a podcast or they see my website or Instagram. So what everyone who comes to see me these days, really since like 2020, has in common is they're all seekers. They're all open to the metaphysical. They're seeking it. They're involved. They're meditators. They've had some kind of transformative experience or they aspire to. They're curious. But they also tend to be folks that recognize that there's value in that I have a long history, 25 years, boots on the ground as a traditional therapist. And I think a lot of people tell me that's that makes them feel comfortable to try some work with me is that I have both to offer, right? I have my feet on the ground, or at least they hope I do, and I have my head in the clouds in a good way, if you know what
Right.
I
And
mean,
so,
right?
so people who are seeking to have these experiences, your years and years, boots on the ground, as you say, is
Right.
is validation that it's not going to be a fakey, hokey. Yeah, I think that's one of the fears that people have when they're trying to get in touch with their own spirituality, and they're looking for a teacher who can help them with that. Is
Yeah.
that it's all going to be some BS, some out there stuff,
Right. Absolutely.
and so that
Yeah.
validation of having those years as a traditional, I think probably really does give them
That's
confidence
right.
to come see you.
I think it does. And like the MDLT, it's not for everybody, and that's fine. And it's elective. It's weird. It's out there. It's not for everybody. I have some people that's all they want to do with me. And so that's all we do. I have other people that I've worked with a long time that I don't even think they know that I do it. Or maybe they do, but they haven't expressed any interest. And that's okay too, right? It's got to be something that calls you. So that's that. But I think maybe the process that I have that blends the two very well is I take a transpersonal or psychospiritual approach to IFS or internal family systems, which is parts work. So that's been around for 40 years. It's nothing new, although it's really caught fire in like the last 15 years, I'd say, in the psychological kind of world at large. But I've always felt from back when I discovered it in 2006, I felt from the get go that it's a shamanic based therapy. And I've always loved it for that reason. I've gone in and out of it for various reasons. But after what I went through in 2018 and 19, and I kind of rebirthed, I realized, oh, it's time to bring IFS back in. And why don't I include it? Why don't I bring in what I'm able to now access with the higher realms and the angelics and the holy ones to come in and hold space for the process. So again, only if people are open to that. I have a handful of people that I do IFS more by the book because I it's not they don't want that or they don't know what that even means. So it's got to be something that people sort of come to on their own. But anyway, I think what I'm trying to say there is that's my depth therapy modality of choice is IFS, parts work. It's just really rooted in the idea. It's utterly intuitive. Like if I asked you right now, Shaw, do you ever feel like you have one part of you that feels a certain way about someone or something, and another part of you that feels diametrically opposed to that?
Yeah, of course.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
of course, right? If you ask any little kid, is there a part of you that wants and feels like you deserve to eat ice cream day and night, 7 days a week, but another part of you that knows it's probably not a good idea, right? Every kid would say, of course, right? So just saying yes to that, you've already embraced the basis of IFS, which is the idea that we all have parts that are fragmented off solar system. The sun in the central is the self, the larger self, or the divine spark, the seed of the soul, the seed of consciousness, that eternal, undamaged part of ourselves, and then we all have parts that are in protective roles, right? Parts that are young and still carry a lot of old pain and such. And the idea is to go in and access self, that eternal, undamaged part of ourselves, marked by feeling calm and curious and open and present and patient and qualities like that. And from there, we try to turn towards the parts of us that are wounded or stuck in protective roles they don't want to be in, to ultimately offer healing and create an integration in a system that for most of us is pretty fragmented. Like there's that old saying that I think still holds up. No one gets into adulthood whole, right? Like by the time we get into adulthood, we're all in pieces. We're all fragmented, right? You know, traumas and losses and abandonments and all the slings and arrows of the human experience. It fragments us, fragments parts of us out into these kind of rigid roles. So IFS is just not the only way, but a beautiful way of bringing integration and harmony and healing. And then I like to do it transpersonally, where much like how we begin an MDLT session, we invoke and invite in the entirety of the divine realm to come in close, lend energy, hold space, and work with us in any way that is for the person's highest and best good. And so often, more and more often, the more I do that process with people, the higher beings come in and they're either lending energy and holding space so that it just goes better, it goes smoother, there's more of a flow in the but also times when we are in particular stages of that work, like particularly in what the unburdening stage, which is where if I was working with you and let's say you accessed a little 5-year-old part of yourself that was letting you know it was carrying a ton of shame and hurt and feeling neglected or abandoned, things like that. After I've had you be with that part and witness and see the scenes of what that little one you, we got to a point where that part was ready for tangible help with releasing and unburdening all that sweet little 5-year-old been carrying. If we have, let's say we have Isis energy present or and maybe a loved one or an ancestor or an archangel energy present with us in the work, that point when we go to set up kind of a shamanic unburdening ceremony for that little one, I will often say to the person, if you want to invite Isis or invite that angel to come in close and work their magic or help in any way that they see would be best. And I'm telling you, there are times where we set up that scenario and my client, the person will say to me, "Oh, Sophia just said, let me take it from here." Or Isis just swooped in and picked up the little one and she's going to go work her magic with her, that kind of thing. So this is
Well,
like this is pretty way out of the bounds of how IFS is done, but this is just what made sense to me to start blending and integrating all of kind of what I got going on in these last years. And by and large, I'm pretty happy and jazzed about how it goes. And I think most times people who come to do this with me are as well. Occasionally there are people that like, yeah, I think I get it, but I don't really, I don't know.
When you've got somebody coming to you that wants more of a traditional type of therapy, you
Mm.
have access to spiritual realms for your therapy. Do you ask them to come in and help you, even though maybe it's not like verbally talked about with your client? Do you know what I'm trying to ask
Uh,
you?
yeah, that's a good question. Occasionally when I'm doing work like even IFS with somebody that I know that is not quite ready to say, yeah, please invite the higher realms in. Sometimes if I feel strongly that there's help here, I will just silently kind of say, yeah, come on in. Just let me know who it is so I know and just hold space. Then that's what will happen. So the client won't all of a sudden feel like there's some higher being with them that they didn't really ask for, right? So it's just holding to help it to go better. But I think maybe a different way I can answer that question is that every morning, at least certainly on my workday mornings, before I have anyone in or log on to a video session, I do a whole ritual of checking in. I do prayers and invocations in the morning, just surrendering to the divine will and giving thanks and all that kind of good stuff. But I will look at who I have on my roster for each day, and I'll specifically ask of all the things that I offer, what is in the view of the divine, what's in the highest and best good for each person? And then I'll make a note in my book of what I get that's in the highest and best good. So for Joe, it might be I'm getting MDLT today. For Sally, it's continue IFS. For these are hypothetical names, right? For Amanda, just integrative counseling, just more or less standard process and talking. Or for somebody else, energy psychology, my subconscious heal and release. So that way I know what's in the larger view, what's in the best good for that person that day. And most of my clients, once they get to know me, they know that I do that. So often they'll come in and say, what did you get is on the menu for today?
Yeah. So the last thing I think, and I did ask you this already, but I would love for you to share at least one big transformation that you have helped facilitate with the higher realms for someone.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd say my best example is with the person who was my guinea pig for the MDLT. So really
They
before it
offered to
even,
be, huh?
yeah. So before it even had a name, the very first person I did it with was my wife, actually. It was on a Mother's Day a couple of years ago. She woke up with a blistering migraine, so bad that we thought we were going to have to cancel all our plans for the day. And just on a nudge, I said, come in and let's just sit. Let's just sit with this and see what happens. And I just kind of did my invocation. And I think it was like seraphim angelics that came in. And we just sat and my head started wobbling around. And 45 minutes or so later, she kind of opens her eyes and is just looking at me. And I said, how do you feel? And she was like, pretty good. I said, how's the headache? Like, where was it when you came in? And is it any different now? And she goes, it was about a 8.5 when we sat here. And it's about a 3 now. And that gave me confidence. I was like, holy shit, there's really something to this. So it was shortly after that that with this one young woman who's like, I don't know, was 23 at that time, but really going on 2300, like old soul and
Yeah.
real, really spiritually precocious. And I learned things from her. We still work together. She was the first person when I said, she actually, when she called me initially, she said, do you do alternate state of consciousness based therapy? And I said, what an interesting question. I don't really know how to answer that. I kind of want to say yes, but I think honestly, the answer is more no, but maybe. Tell me more what you mean by that. And I don't remember what she said, but she made an appointment. We've been working together ever since. And she was the first person when I said, I think I got this new thing that's coming from my personal work. Would you want to just try it? And she was like, yes, let's go. So that's why I call her my guinea pig. So, okay, to try to answer your question, long story short, over the course of now about 2 years, this MDLT process is all we do. And just about every higher being that I've ever had any contact with has come into work for her. And to try to be super specific, this is somebody who had from childhood multiple concussions from like dance and horses and numerous head injuries and all sorts of like kind of underlying prodromal cognitive symptoms and a lot of like nervous system dysregulation related to this like post concussion syndrome type stuff along with this spiritual precociousness. And again, the overlap of the two was very difficult to tease out what was what. So we just started inviting in the higher ups and doing MDLT week after week. And I to try to just wrap this up, basically, long story short, she would tell you now that her nervous system is not only totally regulated, but she feels like she's had safe, progressive Kundalini awakenings in the course of the work. She's had incredibly robust, informative past life information downloads come through from Sophia, Isis, Magdalene energies. It just all sorts of just healing on different levels, physical, somatic, emotional. And most recently, she's come online now as a channel, channeling numerous beings and just remarkably intuitive, balanced, integrated. And she does a lot of other things. I'm not saying it's all attributable to this, but she would tell you that this work has been the bulk of it. So that's just one sort of case example, I guess.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I thank you so much for having come on the show. And I am going to put all your contact information in the show notes so that people can reach out to you. How would you invite people to come work with you?
Sure. Well, okay, right. I'll be kind of funny here and say, I don't know that anyone should. I have an aversion to the word should. I would say anyone that has listened to this or goes to my website or Instagram or whatever, if and only if they feel a nudge or an intuition that maybe some of what I'm describing that I have to offer would be beneficial, then just reach out and we see what happens. Certainly, I guess the prerequisite for what I feel are my most potent offerings, my experiential processes, which are the transpersonal IFS and the MDLT. That's what I want to do most because that's what I feel like is the most potent. I feel it would be best if somebody read those pages on my site. And if they really felt a resonance to that, then we probably have a good alignment there.
Perfect. And I'll put your website down there. And I really do encourage anyone listening to go to Chris's website, therapyoutsidethebox.com. There is so much there.
Yeah, there's a lot there, more than most people read, and that's okay. But I just figure I'm going to put it all there, right? Because I can't answer the phone during the week because I'm with people all week. I can be very responsive by email, but most times if people have questions about like, well, what do you do? I'm just going to kind of refer you to my website because there's so much there.
Yeah. And people will know and they will get a nudge or not. And then that's a great starting
That's
point.
right. That's right. It's really, it's all about alignment. It's all about alignment and resonance.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. This is amazing. We could just keep talking for hours,
I know,
I'm sure, and up and out.
It could be an all-day thing, really. But thank you so much for coming on the show. And I hope that down the road, we'll have you back and we'll have some more conversations.
Anytime. Absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect.
God bless.
You've been listening to the Spirit Mom podcast, where we explore spiritual practices for healing, happiness, and a life of purpose after your child transitions back to spirit. I'm Schall Adams, and I invite you to join us each Monday for enlightening conversations about spirituality, communicating with spirit, and rebuilding the relationship with your child and spirit. Links to reach out to myself and my guests are listed in the show notes. I'm your host, Schall Adams, wishing you a joyful week, and I'll see you next Monday.